Teenagers shoved a 70-year-old teacher. She got up, looked them in the eyes and said, "You just failed my final test." Welcome back and enjoy the story. The autumn wind whipped through the courtyard of Lincoln High School in Chicago, scattering golden leaves across the weathered concrete. Mrs. Eleanor Mitchell, 70 years old with silver hair pinned neatly beneath a navy cardigan, clutched her worn leather satchel as she approached the towering gates. Her weathered hands, marked by decades of chalk dust and countless papers graded by lamplight, trembled slightly. Not from the October chill, but from exhaustion that ran deeper than bone. Behind wire-rimmed glasses, her blue eyes held the weight of 42 years spent believing in students who had forgotten how to believe in themselves. The school loomed before her like a fortress, its brick walls seeming more imposing each day, as if the very institution was preparing to reject her. Like yesterday's lesson plan, the collision came without warning. "Get out of the way, Grandma." The words cut through the morning air like shattered glass. Tyler Davidson, 17 and towering over her diminutive frame, shoved her shoulder with calculated cruelty. Eleanor's world tilted sideways as concrete rushed up to meet her palms. Her satchel exploded open, sending student essays fluttering like wounded birds across the courtyard. The sound of teenage laughter pierced the air, harsh, merciless, echoing off the brick walls. Through her scattered glasses, she watched polished sneakers dance around her fallen form, mocking her vulnerability. No helping hands extended. No voices of protest rose. Even the teachers behind tinted faculty windows turned away, their silence more devastating than the fall itself. Eleanor remained on her knees, heart hammering against her ribs. The humiliation burned hotter than the scrapes on her palms. This place where she had poured her soul, where she'd arrived early and stayed late, where she'd cried with students over their struggles and celebrated their victories, now watched her crawling on, pavement like discarded refuse. "You're too old for this place anyway." Tyler's voice carried a smugness that made her stomach clench. "Time to retire before you break a hip, Miss Mitchell." The words followed her as she gathered scattered papers with shaking hands, each sheet a reminder of students she'd tried to save, lessons she'd crafted with love, dreams she'd nurtured that now seemed foolish and naive. In the faculty lounge, whispered conversations buzzed like angry wasps. "She's tough as nails," someone muttered, stirring sugar into coffee with deliberate casualness. "She'll bounce back." But Eleanor couldn't bounce back, not this time. The weight of indifference pressed down on her shoulders as she sat alone in her dim classroom after the final bell. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting harsh shadows across motivational posters that suddenly seemed like cruel jokes. From her desk drawer, she withdrew a manila folder containing her retirement speech, the words she'd planned to deliver next week at the assembly. But something had shifted. The young woman who'd once stood before this same blackboard, eager to change the world one student at a time, felt like a stranger now. The next morning arrived grey and merciless. Tyler swaggered into her classroom with the same arrogant stride, phone in hand, treating her space like conquered territory. His companions flanked him, their pressed uniforms and expensive accessories, broadcasting privilege earned through birthright rather than effort. Eleanor entered slowly, her cardigan buttoned to the throat, a purple bruise blooming on her wrist like a dark flower. She surveyed the room, these faces she'd tried to reach, these hearts she'd attempted to touch. The silence stretched taut, as violin strings. Then she spoke, her voice soft but carrying the weight of accumulated disappointment. "Before we begin, I want to thank you all for being part of my final class." But this wasn't the end she'd imagined. This was something else, entirely. "Today will be our last lesson together," Eleanor continued, walking slowly between the rows of desks. "And I've prepared a test." Groans erupted like steam from a kettle, but she raised a weathered hand. "This test isn't written on paper. It doesn't require calculators or formulas. It's the final test of your character." She stopped beside Tyler's desk, her shadow falling across his smirking face. The room held its breath. "Yesterday I was pushed to the ground outside this school, not just by the force of hands, but by the silence of witnesses, by the indifference of the very students I've spent my life believing in." Her voice grew stronger with each word, decades of passion finally breaking through the dam of professional restraint. You think you're strong because you made a woman fall? You think you're clever because no one stopped you? You all just failed my final test. Have you ever witnessed cruelty disguised as power? Or stood silent when someone needed your voice? Share your thoughts in the comments. Eleanor reached into her cardigan and withdrew a faded photograph. The image showed a much younger version of herself, arms wrapped around a group of smiling students, their faces bright with hope and possibility. Beneath the photo, handwritten words in careful script. "Thank you for saving my life, Miss Mitchell." She placed it gently on Tyler's desk. That boy was headed for trouble. Gangs, drugs, prison. I tutored him for 2 years after school, stayed with him through failures and small victories. He graduated, went to college, became a teacher himself. Her finger traced the edge of the photograph. This is what real strength looks like, not pushing down those who are smaller, but lifting up those who have fallen. The classroom had transformed into a cathedral of silence, each student suddenly aware of their own breathing. Tyler stared at the photograph, his face draining of color. The swagger melted away, leaving behind something raw and vulnerable. Other students shifted uncomfortably, their confident masks beginning to crack. Eleanor continued, her voice gentler, now but no less powerful. "I wasn't planning to say goodbye today, but maybe this school doesn't need teachers like me anymore. Maybe you don't need someone who believes in your potential when you've given up on yourselves." She turned toward the door, her small frame somehow commanding the entire room. "Or maybe you just need to learn what respect really means." Each step toward the exit felt like walking through water, heavy with the weight of 4 decades spent in service to an ideal that seemed increasingly elusive. But then a voice cracked through the silence. "Miss Mitchell, wait." Tyler stood up, his tall frame trembling like a reed in the wind. The words seemed to struggle from somewhere deep in his chest. I'm sorry. I didn't know. I didn't think." His voice broke on the last word, years of carefully constructed toughness crumbling in an instant. Eleanor turned slowly, seeing not the arrogant teenager who had shoved her down, but a lost boy trying to find his way back to something decent. "No," she replied softly. "You didn't think, but now you can start." The room began to shift, invisible, barriers dissolving as students looked at each other with new eyes, seeing perhaps for the first time the shared humanity they had worked so hard to deny. What happened next surprised everyone, including Eleanor herself. One by one, students began to stand. First Sarah, the quiet girl in the back row, then Marcus from the middle section, then others whose names she had whispered in prayers during sleepless nights. They approached her desk hesitantly, pulling crumpled papers from backpacks and folders. Apologies written in shaky handwriting. Confessions of gratitude they had never found the courage to voice. "You were the only teacher who believed in me. When my father left," whispered Amanda, tears streaming down her cheeks. "You stayed after school to help me with algebra, when everyone else said I was stupid," added James, his voice thick with emotion. The floodgates had opened, and 42 years of small kindnesses came rushing back like a tide of redemption. By the time Eleanor reached the front gate, she was no longer alone. Principal Williams waited beside the entrance, his usually stern expression softened by something approaching reverence. "Miss Mitchell," he said, his voice unsteady, "we saw the security footage. The cameras caught everything that happened yesterday, and your speech this morning." He paused, collecting himself. "The school board wants to honor you. They're asking if you would consider staying 1 more year, not as a regular teacher, but as a mentor for our new faculty, someone to teach them what you've taught us today." Eleanor looked back at the building that had been her second home, seeing it now not as a fortress, but as a garden where seeds of character could still take root and grow. That evening, Eleanor sat in her small apartment, grading papers by the warm glow of her desk lamp, when a gentle knock came at her door. Through the peephole she saw them, a small group of students standing awkwardly on her doorstep, arms full of wildflowers picked from the vacant lot behind the school. Not expensive roses or carefully arranged bouquets, but honest offerings, gathered with their own hands. She invited them in, brewing tea in her grandmother's china cups, and for the first time in months, her living room filled with the sound of young voices sharing their dreams and fears. Tyler sat quietly in the corner, still processing the seismic shift in his understanding of strength and character, while other students shared stories she had never heard about her impact on their lives, their families, their futures. As the evening wound down and the students prepared to leave, Eleanor felt something she thought she had lost forever, the unshakable certainty that her life had mattered. These young people, flawed and struggling and beautiful in their imperfection, carried pieces of her wisdom into a world that desperately needed teachers, healers, and believers. The physical pain in her wrists had faded, but more importantly, the ache in her heart had transformed into something else entirely: hope. She realized that retirement didn't mean the end of her influence, but the beginning of a different kind of teaching, one that would ripple outward through the lives she had touched. Standing at her window after the last student had gone home, Eleanor looked out at the Chicago skyline twinkling in the distance. Tomorrow she would call Principal Williams and accept his offer to mentor new teachers. She would share the photograph of her former student, now grown and making his own difference in the world. She would tell them that the most important lessons happen not in curriculum guides but in moments of choice, when we decide to lift someone up rather than tear them down, when we choose compassion over cruelty, when we remember that every person carries infinite potential waiting to be unlocked by someone who believes. The autumn wind had stilled, and the night was peaceful. Eleanor Mitchell, teacher, mentor, and keeper of dreams, smiled as she prepared for whatever tomorrow might bring. The final test, she realized, was never really about the students at all. It was about remembering why she became a teacher in the first place, not to fill empty heads with facts, but to kindle the spark of humanity in every heart she encountered. And in that small apartment, surrounded by the lingering warmth of young voices and the promise of new beginnings, Eleanor understood that some lessons are worth a lifetime of teaching. Respect isn't demanded or enforced. It's earned through countless small acts of love, patience, and unwavering faith in the possibility that every person can become better than they were yesterday. In the end, that's the only test that truly matters. Congratulations, type 7 in the comments so I know you stayed with me until the end. Leave a like and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. See you.